Footsteps by J.K. Knauss. Text copyright 2020 by Jessica Knauss. This recording copyright 2022 Jessica Knauss. Sevilla, 1350. The Moors in Sevilla may have been our mortal enemies, but I can't fault anything they built in this city. The narrow streets provide relief from the unrelenting sun. Their splendid church, which we Christians use now, has a tower with wide ramps anyone can ascend to view all the wonders of Sevilla at once, as if we were the great storks that fly in to roost at dusk. My Alfonso's great-grandfather, for whom he was named, is entombed there, and sometimes I'm permitted to take the short walk accompanied by a guard, to light candles and say prayers for him. The gardens here in the royal palace carry my worries away on bubbling fountains and fragrances of orange, honeysuckle, and jasmine. My room in the Christian part of the palace has elegant vaulted ceilings and colourful painted tile walls. But whenever I'm allowed, I like to come to the old quarters, where Almohad hands crafted delicate arcs and curlicues into plaster and channeled calming currents like brooks across the floor. It's a beautiful prison. Some mornings, a cooing dove or a strutting peacock brings me to a state that is not quite waking, and I believe I can feel Alfonso's weight on the bed, hear him sigh in the uneasy slumber of a king. For an instant, Spain is ours, he's still at my side, and the nightmare is over. Those are the worst mornings. When I understand that the sensation was only the dearest hope of my heart, I have to relive those last days and try to fathom why God took him away from me, away from Spain, so suddenly, so brutally. We were in Gibraltar only 4 months ago, besieging the city for the 5th time, as I thought was right. But God must not have agreed. After Alfonso and I set up camp and sent our demands, nothing changed. We blocked their fresh water and sank their supply ships, but Gibraltar must have been populated with ghouls who needed no mortal sustenance. The great dying took half of our foot soldiers, and it seemed we would never win the city back from Granada's pagan hands. But even so, Alfonso had faced worse. I didn't know why he was acting more irritable than I'd ever seen him. "We should ask the King of Portugal to send reinforcements," said the commander in the strategy tent that evening, the Monday before Easter. Alfonso slammed his hand on the table and swept a wineskin off it. "I don't know why I brought any of you here. You're all against me," he shouted. He stomped on the wineskin, soaking the straw flooring and splattering the boots of his trusted advisers and generals. The men remained silent. None of them were accustomed to such an outburst. Alfonso hadn't acted like that since before I met him, 20 years ago. In his rage, he reached for a map of the city spread out on the table. I knew if he mangled it the cause was lost, so I stayed his hand with the lightest caress. "There, there, my love," I murmured. "That's enough for today. Let's get some rest. I'll write to your sons tomorrow and they'll come and help us. We'll win Gibraltar in time for Easter feasting." His blue eyes regarded me from between stray strands of golden hair. I saw no recognition, so I sent the men away and grasped his hand. It burned me, but the light returned to his eyes. "Leonor, Leonor," he said, "I ache all over, inside and out." Another winter ailment, I was sure. After all, he was 38 years old and had been a warrior for nearly all of them. A body can only take so much before it demands rest. I walked Alfonso to our private tent the way one leads a skittish horse. I undressed him and arranged the blankets to make a cradle for him, but not cover him. He was too hot. The bed strings groaned as he contorted in search of relief. I took up the enormous peacock fan by the bed, but I was too exhausted to imagine fanning my love all night long. I thought I'd been through everything he had, and had earned my rest too. I went to the door and whispered to the page standing guard, "Come and keep the king cool while he rests." The page was wearing mittens and a heavy cloak to guard against the night, and must have wondered why the king was too warm, but he obeyed silently. I left my dress on for modesty and to avoid catching a chill from the fan. I lay next to Alfonso and smoothed the hair over his brow. "I love you," I barely heard him say. Maybe he never said it, and I'm only wishing he had. He kissed me with the passion of first love. Or last love? Did he know what was happening? I fell asleep quickly, untroubled, in spite of the incessant fanning, in spite of my darling's constant movement and groans of misery. I didn't hear him then, but now those groans accompany me everywhere, a prison I can never escape from. I awoke in the dark to the sound of my name. "Lady Leonore! Awake! Lady Leonore! What do I do?" the page whimpered. "Leonore! Leonore!" Alfonso bellowed, as he thrashed the blankets to the floor. "I'm here, my love," I said. "Help," he said, in greatest secrecy. "Tell those devils to stop pulling on me. Tell the angels to kill the devils forever. Then I can sleep. Thank you, darling." I reached out, and my hand came to rest on my love's neck. It was not the prickly bearded skin I knew so well. It hardly felt like skin at all, only sickness, something untouchable from the forest floor. "Bring a torch from outside," I told the page, and when he did, I regretted it. The firelight confirmed what my hand had felt, what I never imagined could happen to my love, the king. He'd survived battles, freak storms, hunger, thirst, and 2 years of losing our people to the plague God sent to punish, I thought, only the poor laborers and the lowest of the low. Why would God want to strike him with that filth, when Alfonso had never done anything but God's will? "My love, did you visit the foot soldiers?" I asked. "Send them away. They're dragging me to hell with them. I won't go." "He did visit them, my lady, 3 days ago," the page said. "Why?" "He wanted to raise spirits after the great dying." Where had I been? Why hadn't I stopped him? "Leonore! Leonore!" Alfonso writhed in my arms. "Should I go for the physician?" asked the page. I sat up. "He can do nothing. What happens now is God's will," I told the page and myself. "Don't bother to tell the commanders or anyone else either. In the morning, we'll all know exactly what God wants." I had the page take the torch back outside so I wouldn't have to watch my love's suffering. I held Alfonso fast for the rest of that eternal night. I kept him still as he fought the demons only he saw. I whispered in his ear, smoothed his hair, and kissed his sweet face. After hours that seemed like days, he stopped struggling. "Alfonso, darling," I whispered. I held my fingers to his lips to feel what he said. "Leonore." The breath of life was still in him, though it became shallow. I had the impression that his spirit, the human being God had made in the likeness of his perfection, had fled the putrid body, so it became a hollow, useless shell, even as it shuddered and sighed. And I loved it still, because it had been his body. Tears cascaded from my eyes to warm his face. I don't know when Alfonso XI, king of my heart, took his last breath, only that it was in the dark, and that he did not pass on alone. The best part of my own soul went with him. I still held the body close to me, weeping silently, when the first rays of light that Tuesday before Easter filtered through the tent's canvas. I had last kissed my love's face what seemed like decades before, and had become as still as he. The page opened the tent flap to 4 or 5 of the commanders, who stopped speaking amongst themselves mid-sentence. When I think about what they must have seen, I'm blasphemous. I must have looked like Mary cradling her beloved son when he descended from the cross. Her love for our Saviour was not greater than mine for Alfonso. One of the commanders strode to the bed and pulled the king out of my arms, something I would have thought impossible. "The king is dead! The plague has taken him!" Amid confused gasps and exclamations, another of the commanders spoke sense. "We must tell the queen." It felt as though the entire tent fell away, and every soldier left alive in camp were staring at Alfonso's corpse, and then at me, their gazes burning holes in the fabric of my dress. I was presented at Alfonso's court in Sevilla when I was a young widow, but he had married Maria of Portugal 2 years before. I often wondered why the instant, permanent bond arose between us at such an awkward time, but the queen never offered an opinion, and never helped when she easily could have, when the Catalans left the Canary Islands and Portugal wanted them, so it was only natural that Alfonso turned to me time after time. He rewarded me for the children I gave him and my counsel with lands and titles until I became a permanent fixture at court and more of a companion to him than Queen Maria would ever be. My tears ran out with the shock. Without the king to stand next to, what was my place? Where were my children? Only they could help me in a world without their father. Someone led me to my lady's tent, where I looked down to find the front of my dress covered with blood and pus. One of my ladies took it off me and replaced it with a fresh one, and I wish she hadn't. I haven't been able to find that dress since. She probably burned it, and the dress I wore when I last held my true love went up in smoke. The commanders broke the siege and made ready to return north without consulting me. For all the asking I did, I couldn't confirm where they intended to bury Alfonso, but when I climbed into the wagon next to his wasted shell, no one said anything. I'm not sure how many days I bumped and jostled in that wagon, possibly 4 or 5. I don't know how or if Easter was observed among the troops. At Jerez de la Frontera, embalmers removed Alfonso's entrails. I placed their box in a niche in the royal chapel in the palace there, and masses were sung. They sounded all wrong, the tones coming in too high or too low, hollow. The commanders acted quickly, keen to bring the body back to the Queen and their son Pedro in Sevilla to secure the royal succession, but I was in no condition to notice details. Only my most faithful servants bothered to keep me alive with food that might have been the finest on offer, but it tasted like nothing on my tongue and felt coarse in my throat. It was almost too much effort to swallow, to breathe. The only thing that came effortlessly was thought. Holding my surviving children in my mind made me strong. There were 8 of them, all with noble titles, and the Queen had only one son. I could never be the Queen, but I could become the Queen Mother. By the time we approached the royal palace in Sevilla, I had thought about the encounter so many times, I almost believed it had already taken place. I would send the Queen back to Portugal where she belonged, and her Pedro could go with her and keep her company. Even the Queen's guards should obey my orders because I had been at the King's side in life and in death. Who knew what he wanted better than I? Our cortege pulled up before the Queen and Pedro and their court in the entrance patio as if they had been waiting for us all along. But no, they were only waiting for Alfonso's cold remains. Queen Maria refused to look at me, turning her veiled face to the linen-wrapped cadaver at my side. Her thin hands prodded at the shoulders as if she could wake him. It was something I'd tried many times before I had to pray over the entrails in Jerez. Since she hadn't seen his buboes, heard his delirious shouting, or felt the blood on her dress, I couldn't blame her. Maria, I said, still seated in the cart, still in possession of Alfonso, towering over her. From the bewilderment of grief, her face flashed to unabashed rage. The movement was obvious even under her veil. Before she could give voice to her thoughts, her mountainous squire, Fernandez de Olmedo, clasped her and guided her away, and her son, the new King Pedro himself, extended his hand to help me down from the cart. "Leonor," he said, looking for all the world like a 15-year-old taller version of my Alfonso, with that flop of blonde hair and sympathy in his gaze. I took his hand and stepped down, and before my shoes hit the cobblestones, he had his arms around me. I pushed back at first, but Pedro's embrace was gentle, and I dissolved into his musculature like salt in water. "I couldn't save him," I blubbered. "I did what I could, but the plague can't be stopped. Only the great dying could have taken your father. No one could have slain him in battle. He would have lived forever." "I know," Pedro said. He pulled away, and I interred my tears in my hands. "Leonor, we'll bury my father here in Sevilla, and we'll give you rooms here in the palace. You're the mother of the only siblings I have, but please, try not to cross my mother. She told me to send you into exile." Pedro is right. I need to avoid the Queen, but the sympathy I have for him is the kind of affection any child would elicit in a mother like me. Even and especially with the regents he has to influence him, he'll never be the decisive warrior ruler his father was. When I first arrived here, I wrote letters to each of my children to tell them how their father had died, valiantly, confessed, and at peace with God, and how I was living in the palace in Sevilla, comfortably, but missing them. Then, awaiting their responses, I took to strolling about the palace and happening to end up in the Chamber of Justice. It's the latest addition. My Alfonso had Moorish craftsmen build it with an extraordinary coffered ceiling and intricate plaster walls with Castilian coats of arms. It's also where I listen in on what Maria and Pedro's regents tell him. One morning I happened to arrive in the doorway especially early, and Pedro was still alone. He'd taken to his royal responsibilities with admirable earnestness, and he stood in the centre of the chamber wringing his hands. When he looked up from the fountain he had been studying so intently, relief washed over his round face. "Lady Leonore, I'm so confused. What would father have done?" Stunned, it took me a moment to realize this was my moment to stride toward him and take his hand. "What's the matter?" I asked the boy, then added, "my king," as an afterthought. "Half my advisers think we should support the House of Valois against England, and the rest think we should side with the Plantagenets. Honestly, I don't know why they don't make peace," he explained with a slight lisp. "They each have enough problems in their own countries with the lack of labourers. They lose more every day to the grey dying, just like we do." I let go of his hand so he wouldn't feel my urgency. It was vital he take my advice, but he would surely flee me if I frightened him with the forcefulness Alfonso had always admired. "Your father, who had this magnificent chamber built to discuss just this kind of issue, valued loyalty highly. England has always been our ally, especially since Eleanor's marriage to King Edward was so successful. But perhaps equally important, the English buy most of the wool produced in Castile, even after the arrival of the plague. Many fields lie fallow, and at the last Cortes, half of the monasteries and towns were unable to pay their tributes or send the soldiers we needed because there just wasn't the same number of people as there were before. If we were to suddenly make enemies of the English, the economy of the Central Meseta would irreparably collapse." "Oh!" He looked startled in spite of my best efforts. I gave him a reassuring smile. "Not to worry, you're the king. You can prevent all of that simply by staying loyal to the English cause. Whatever they ask for, they've earned it with their friendship over these many years." "That's what your father would say," I finished, rather than "that's what I would tell your father." A great commotion of footsteps interrupted our confidence, and Queen Maria and Fernandez de Olmedo passed into the grand archway, with other noble regents behind. Although her leathery squire dwarfed her, Maria drew herself to her full height when she saw me, and seemed to fill the chamber. I thought lightning bolts would rain down from the coffered ceiling as she shouted at me, but she surprised me by gently touching Fernandez de Olmedo's hand, and saying so low I barely heard, "Please escort Lady Leonore back to her chamber." When Fernandez de Olmedo's hulk advanced toward me, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. "I'll go," I shrilled. "I'll leave the king to his business. Thank you for your time, your majesty." I caught Pedro's eye as I turned to the archway, but before I could be sure he'd take my advice, Fernandez de Olmedo lumbered between us. I strode back to my room, keeping well ahead of the queen's squire as he trailed me. I took it into my head that his touch was poisonous to me, that if he touched me I would break out in boils and buboes and perish as painfully as my love. Perhaps Alfonso could have spent more time with Pedro and taught him to rule properly even if he didn't take to it naturally. But since the queen keeps me from him so I can't set his father's example for him, the only remedy now will have to come from my children. They did benefit from Alfonso's love and guidance. After that day, I've tried to stay in the doorway behind the council's back, and if Queen Maria sees me, I casually gather up my skirts and head to the gardens, feeling her gaze bore into my back the whole way. The bits and pieces of news I gather from those moments are my small triumphs over a woman I didn't realize would defend her position so jealously. One morning, far too long after my arrival, the maid they've given me had just finished braiding my hair and arranging my headpiece when Pedro appeared, looking even more serious than when he took advice in the Chamber of Justice. "What is it?" I asked. "My king?" "Enrique Alfonso of Castile, Lord of the County of Norena, Count of Trastamara, Lord of Lemos, Sarria, Cabrera, and Ribera, to see you, Lady Leonore." My Enrique, my eldest surviving son, the third I gave Alfonso, emerged from behind the archway with the confident grin that would give him away anywhere. I held him, making sure he was still as hale as I'd last seen him. I wiped the tears from my eyes, much sweeter than the tears I cried most days, and observed the half-brothers standing together. Enrique was only a couple of years older than Pedro, and yet he was already a man, full of his father's vigor and strength, but with my darker coloring. Enrique was the eldest of a pair, but thank God he lacked the telltale thinness and weakness that marked most twins I'd known. "I'll let you two share your stories," lisped Pedro. "Thank you, my king, for bringing my son to me," I said as he left. I crushed Enrique to me again. This time I never intended to let go. And your brothers and sister, how are they? Haven't they received my letters? They've all written back to you as far as I know. Federico wanted to come with me, but I told him only one of us at a time should be absent from our holdings. You're right, of course. Has the Queen seen you? Pedro seemed to treat you well. The Queen Mother didn't deign to see me. He slipped away to pace the chamber. Mother, are you a prisoner? Is this room a palace or a dungeon? Look at it this way. At least I'm alive. God knows I haven't always wanted to be alive since the great dying took your father, but Maria, or even Pedro, could have accused me of any number of things. Most importantly, you and your brothers and sister are alive too, and still hold your titles. All of it could have been taken away as soon as your father was no longer there to defend you. I see neither your grief nor your imprisonment have dulled your political acumen, but while my father lived, why did you never ask him to divorce Maria, or put her away? Then I would be the king now, and Pedro would be the one shrouded in uncertainty. You saw us together. Who looks like the legitimate one? He spoke the truth, but too loudly in my prison. Don Juan Manuel once advised me to demand an annulment, I said equally loudly, hoping someone else would hear. But I knew putting Maria away would have started a war with Portugal, and we've always needed our cousins to the west as our allies against the pagans in Granada. I suspect Juan Manuel didn't have Castile's best interests at heart. I went into seclusion at the convent of San Clemente when you were young, after your brother Juan was born, just to prove to Portugal that Maria was a valued royal partner to your father. Shortly after we won the Battle of Salado River with Portuguese help, my sister Juana was born. You weren't much of a nun, Mother. I crossed the room to whisper in Enrique's ear, that flesh that was mine and Alfonso's, a living testament to our love. We can't speak freely here, my son and future king. I think someone is always listening to me. So it is that bad for you, he whispered back. Do they suspect you're not going to conform to their wishes? Should I try to get you out of here? No. Here is where I can stay on top of what happens in court, even if they don't want me to. You can best help me by doing something else. I want you to get married. He startled, but kept his voice under control. Married? To whom? Don Juan Manuel is dead now, so his political machinations can't hurt us any more. His daughter is the heiress to the lordship of Biscaya, and the great-granddaughter of King Fernando the Saint. A marriage between you would make you rich and wildly strengthen your legitimacy for the throne, and she's about your age. It would really be best for Spain. Please consider it. Of course I will, Mother, if you think it's best, he murmured. When have you ever been wrong? I couldn't save your father, I moaned. We never should have gone to Gibraltar. Enrique held me for moments that were far too short, while I wailed, shamelessly pitying myself. I heard swift footsteps, and Fernandez de Olmedo and another of the Queen's squires, just who I'd wanted to witness the scene, arrived at the chamber door. King Pedro wants to see Don Enrique, said Fernandez de Olmedo. Right now, said the other. I'll do everything I can to ensure your comfort, Enrique said, holding my face in his hands. Stay strong. When he drew away, I cried, I love you, my darling son, and prostrated myself on the bed until I was sure the Queen's men were gone. It's August, and the only remedy against the heat is to press my cheek to the cold tile floor. I'm not allowed into the chambers with the fountains any more, and no maid comes to dress me or braid my hair. Although I will never recover what I lost when Alfonso died in my arms, after Enrique's visit, I had no hope for my future as a powerful influence on the Castilian crown. I continued to sulk about the palace, making sure everyone close to the Queen saw how distraught I was, and in this way I overheard news about the war with Granada and about my children. Then one day, news that was no surprise to me arrived in a surprising way. The curtain was drawn across the archway into my chamber. I was lying in bed, still unable to sleep through to the morning after 4 months, wondering when my maid would appear to start the day. I heard footsteps, but they were too hurried to be my maid. The curtain snapped open, and the Queen charged to the side of my bed so quickly I hardly had time to sit up. Fernandez de Olmedo trudged after her, and I gathered blankets about me to shield against him. How dare you? Queen Maria seethed. After everything we've done for you, do you think we wouldn't notice you were plotting to overthrow Pedro? Her normally white face was as green as my sheets, as if she had been possessed by a dragon demon. Overthrow? I choked. Your son Enrique married Juana Manuel de Villena, heiress of Vizcaya, 4 days ago. Go ahead, explain to me how that doesn't make his lands, resources, and soldiers equal to or greater than Pedro's. I was thrilled Enrique had followed my advice, and so quickly I couldn't think fast enough for the Queen. "Your hand is all over this," she hissed, using unexpected strength to force the blankets off me. I pulled my shift over my knees, but Fernandez de Olmedo's gaze still devoured my body. "You're wrong," I said. "This is news to me, too. How could I have arranged a marriage from here? I'm in no condition to think of such things anyway." I thought of the warmth of Alfonso's lips the last time he spoke my name, to start a flow of fat, hot tears. "Enrique never met Juana Manuel before. Why would it occur to him to marry her? And he's only 17. Why would he hurry to marry anyone?" The Queen's insight bewildered me. I'd had no idea who I was up against. At this crucial moment, almost naked before her and her poisonous accessory, I was speechless. Queen Maria glanced at Fernandez de Olmedo, and his hairy arms reached toward me. I shrank from him. "No, I'll go wherever you want me to," I told the Queen, "but don't let him touch me." Almost suffocating under their folds, I carried my own dresses to this windowless room where one of the Queen's men guards me day and night. I haven't received any visitors since I moved here. I think even Pedro has been told to stay away. Do they think I would try to kill him here in my prison cell? I'm permitted to move about the palace, but only if accompanied by a guard on duty. More often than not, it seems to be Fernandez de Olmedo, so I spend most of my time here, hoping my children know how much of a threat Queen Maria has turned out to be. I pray to Christ, his mother, the apostles, and Saint Clement to send word to my children that now, yes, now, I need their help. Talavera de la Reina, 1351. Talavera de la Reina, the Queen's city on the river. Alfonso granted this place to Queen Maria when they married. I hate it. I'm surrounded by some of the strongest walls in all Castile, trapped in a square tower, in a castle built by Moors when this place was theirs. The daylight hardly hits my face through the arrow slots, and I shiver under rough wool blankets. My only human contact is Fernandez de Olmedo's stone face as he looks in on me, or brings food I can hardly choke down because I wonder if it's poisoned. The terror he used to provoke in me has subsided. He never says much of anything. I might as well talk to these walls. Queen Maria lives here in the castle with us. Although she never visits me, I feel her presence like a weight on my chest. If she leaves the castle for even a few hours, I take advantage to breathe more freely, but even then it's as if the walls obey her command to keep vigil on me. I think I see them come closer in every day, gradually squeezing the air out of the room, until one day I suffocate. In January, Queen Maria came to my room in the palace in Sevilla. I heard Fernandez de Olmedo's heavy footsteps outside the door come to a stop to listen in. The Queen told me that she and Pedro were travelling to the Cortes, to be held in Valladolid. "We'll pass through lands held by the Order of Santiago," she said, strolling about the chamber without looking at me. "Pedro thought you might like to join us." "Will I be able to see Fadrique?" "Oh, that's right. Enrique's twin is the Grand Master of the Order of Santiago. Perhaps something can be arranged. We'll certainly let him know where you'll be." She looked over her shoulder at what must have been my hopeful expression, and smirked. And still I didn't suspect what was to come. The thoughts of seeing Fadrique after so many meaningless months of hardly feeling like I'd ever had children at all obliterated my reasoning. It started innocuously. They gave me back the maid to help me pack and make me more elegant for the journey. They gave me my own covered wagon so I could bundle up against the winter. But we made it no farther than Alcalá del Rio, only a half-day's journey, even in the wet weather we'd started in, when the convoy came to a halt in the middle of the town square. Fernandez de Olmedo parted my curtains and reached toward me. I leaped out the other side, only to be confronted with what might have been several days of plague victims, blighted corpses laid out in 2 neat rows, awaiting transport to a crematorium or mass grave. I covered my mouth in dismay. I'd had no idea the great dying was so close to Sevilla. 2 others of the Queen's guards found me and took me by the arms to stand on the other side of my wagon, where what was left of the town had gathered around the fountain and were kneeling before Pedro. It was the first time I'd seen the king in months, and he had grown into his role considerably, accepting his subjects' demonstrations of loyalty with a regal wave of the hand and squinted eyes. Beside Pedro, his mother watched me arrive. She strode to me with her arm outstretched, and I understood I had to take her hand. She looked me in the eyes while she announced to the town people, "Look, it's Leonor Núñez de Guzman, a noble native of Sevilla. You may remember, she used to spend a lot of time with King Alfonso, may he rest in peace. Come, Leonor." The Queen's grip nearly pulverized my hand before she led me to Pedro. I tried to read the King's face, but too quickly Queen Maria used the surprising power in her hand to clutch my shoulder painfully, pressing against bone, and push down so that I had little choice but to kneel before Pedro. The applause started out tepid, but the Queen raised her arms. "Observe how ambition bows before legitimacy!" The townspeople clapped harder and added some shouts and whistles I tried hard not to listen to, until Queen Maria was satisfied. They never threw rocks or anything else, but my skin was as bruised as if they had. I climbed back into my wagon, dreading the next town. And I was right. We stopped everywhere with enough survivors to gather a crowd, sometimes 2 or 3 a day, and it was always the same, except that I came out of the wagon before Fernandez de Olmedo had a chance to open the curtain. And except for Llerena. The retinue was welcomed into the palace of the Grand Master of the Order of Santiago in Llerena, almost as if the past year had never taken place. I saw Fadrique framed by archways, the image of his twin, Enrique, a commanding presence with his hands on his hips, and it took my breath away to think this warrior was my son. The astonishment didn't last long, because when he caught sight of me, he ran across the courtyard, passing Pedro and the Queen as if they weren't there, to catch me up in his arms. I gave myself over to the sensation of the moment, inhaling the scent of his hair and velvet tunic, letting him kiss my cheeks and hands. I knew that even if Spain had already forgotten what we had done to keep its people safe from the Aragonese, the Moors, and their own ruthless nobles, Alfonso and I were immortalized in our children. While observing royal protocols and ensuring Pedro and Queen Maria wanted for nothing, Fadrique managed to make me feel I could look to my side and see his father sitting there. Everything made sense as my son served a feast as great as before the plague arrived. I didn't even stop to wonder how he managed to make it seem as if there had been no unusual casualties. That evening, Fadrique showed me to a chamber that had to be bigger and better furnished than the ones he'd given Pedro and Queen Maria, and sat with me by the fireplace, murmuring over the life-sustaining cracks and pops. He told me news about his brothers and sister, eyeing the door. Finally, he leaned in close. "We've all heard the way they're parading you through Castile on the way to the Cortes in Valladolid. We can't allow this." I took his hands in mine. "I do need your help, darling. I thought of little else, but I can't allow any of you to risk your lands, titles, or lives. That's what it would mean to help me. The best thing for you all to do is support Enrique every way you can. Your father and I taught him well, and I'm confident he'll do what's best for Spain." "We do, of course we all do, Mother," said Fadrique, and I will never forget the look of love and devotion he gave me. "By the way, Enrique is very happy with Juan Manuel. Do you think you could arrange a marriage like that for me?" I chuckled ruefully into my collar. "I'll see what I can do." I kissed his forehead. I didn't sleep well in spite of the comfort and hope Fadrique had provided. The sound of Fernandez de Olmedo's footsteps pacing outside my chamber door all night was a constant reminder of my powerlessness. I lived on that short meeting for the next 15 days as the Spain Alfonso and I had shared became a ceaseless succession of merciless strangers who applauded my humiliation before someone my true love had raised me above. I assumed we would stay in Valladolid until the Cortes came to an end, and hoped I would find a way to talk to some of the sympathetic nobles, but the Queen must have read my mind. She didn't even stay with her son while he governed, but ushered me here to her city, her fortress, which they say was built by the invincible hand of Abderrahman. The towers cast a shadow over my cart as we entered Talavera, and I knew that evening in Llerena was the last time I would see any of my children. Since that day I haven't seen the outside of this chamber. I escape only in the dreams I've taken to having all times of day. Asleep, I see and touch my Alfonso as he was before Gibraltar, and glimpse the futures of my children. With my eyes closed, I witnessed the growth of my grandchildren and Spain's recovery from the great dying. I loved a king. I helped him bring our nation safely through tragedies no king has ever seen before. I bore him 10 children. I watched him die in a gruesome act of God. I wished more times than I can count that I had died there with him. I've made it this far only to face death alone, but I've seen it in dreams. My children will start a new royal line and lead Spain to glory. For now, I listen to Fernandez de Olmedo's muffled footsteps as he paces the hall and wonder when he's coming in to kill me. Inspiration for J.K. Knauss's Footsteps. A resident of Zamora, Spain, J.K. Knauss has been writing fiction set in medieval Spain with the support of the multiple accolade-winning low writers of Tucson, Arizona, ever since she completed her Ph.D. in medieval Spanish literature. Her epic novel, Seven Noble Knights, is based on legendary acts that may have taken place in the formative 10th century. When she thinks of the effects of the Black Death in Spain, Leonor's fascinating character and long-lasting legacy always come to mind. Leonor Núñez de Guzmán y Ponce de León was the most powerful and influential woman in Castile while King Alfonso XI was alive. She gave birth to 10 of his children, while his wife, Maria of Portugal, had only 2. After his death, Maria held Leonor captive in Sevilla, which must have been a satisfying way to exercise her power as the legitimate widow. Although the new king, Pedro, was sympathetic to Leonor and tried to find a place for her at court, her ambitions got the best of her. Her plots to take back her previous power included colluding with her son Enrique against Maria and Pedro. When Maria found out about the plots, life got successively worse for Leonor until the queen's squire, Fernandez de Olmedo, killed her. Leonor was never accused of or tried for any crimes. Her death, viewed as an assassination, was the last reason Enrique needed to justify his claim to the throne, and civil war broke out. After many years of struggle, Enrique became the first king of the Trastamara line, which would eventually give the world Isabel la Católica. Learn more about J.K. Knauss at jessicaknauss.com. Footsteps is one story in the anthology We All Fall Down, Stories of Plague and Resilience, which was published March 1st, 2020, and contains stories by David Blixt, Gill, Kristin Gleeson, J.K. Knauss, Laura Morelli, Katherine Pym, Deborah Swift, Melodie Winawer, and Lisa J. Yarde. Thank you very much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe to this channel to hear even more amazing, surprising, and historical stories. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.